Oh, a fair sum of you. All right. So we
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, my name is Meagan Cooney, and I am a platform engineer at Ibotta. I'll figure out how my screen is split. Okay, now we're good. Oh, you aren't? Okay. Yeah, I think I need to change. Hold, please. Does anyone else have any hiring updates? While we,
Yeah, so I'm Ben. I'm with Ibotta. We provide training for data occasionally. So we're hiring for a bunch of different positions. We're hiring iOS engineer, Android engineer. I think especially the Android engineer is open to junior developers as well. We have platform engineer, big data engineer, senior engineer. We also have several like marketing analytics positions, product positions, pretty much across the board we're hiring. So if you have any questions about Ibotta, we're one of the largest shopping apps in the US. We provide discounts, cashback rebates on mobile apps and physical locations. So if you have any questions about that or you're interested, also we're
I think I hit it maybe in the wrong window. It's weird. Okay. Try one more time. There we go. Okay, cool. Live stream.
All right, let's go. Meagan Cooney.
All right. So my presentation tonight is on GraphQL and Ember. I am a platform engineer at Ibotta, and this is my view out the window of my dead cactus before it sadly passed away. You can find me on GitHub at meaganc.github.io. And so GraphQL, what is GraphQL? GraphQL is a query language for your API, which sounds pretty cool, but what does that mean? So GraphQL lets you replace multiple REST requests with a single call to fetch the data you specify. And this comes from the GitHub developer documentation for their own GraphQL endpoint for their public GraphQL server. So if you're interested in reading more about kind of like how they approach GraphQL and kind of a really good introduction to a public API that you can use, I highly recommend GitHub's. I didn't use it for the presentation tonight because they asked for a lot of permissions that I wasn't really comfortable giving access to for some of my repos that people may have given me permission to give read access to. So also a little security update on that. Everyone check your repo health. So what else you might be using currently? REST JSON APIs. And so let's say if you're getting data about some sort of like user or customer or cats, musicians, it might take multiple calls to get what you need. So like give me all of your users and then all of their posts. This is the app that we're going to be building. It is musicians and cats with our artist model and our album model, and I picked this one because they both have the same album, and also they had lots of pictures with cats. And so kind of to compare like what the sample JSON response might look like to build this app, this is kind of like, you know, we have all of our artist information, and then we have all of our album information, and like we might have to then request even more stuff if we want to build out the actual app. So the similar query in GraphQL would look like this. So this was kind of to break it down, like how this actually is something that might be useful or an improvement. And one of the reasons why a lot of people are looking to move to GraphQL for their API interactions is that GitHub found that when they were like with their old hypermedia API, 60% of their database activity was coming from all of these API requests because people had to get like the information about like the repo and the users and all of that. So it was pretty intense use of their API. So this is kind of another like more real world example of an old or JSON API from Kiva, the loans microfinance company. And this is their equivalent in GraphQL. And it's not entirely one-to-one kind of mapping of their existing REST endpoint and their current GraphQL, but it is also pretty useful if you're really interested in learning and seeing something else that's out there and available to look at. So that's how you can access it if you'd like to. And so kind of the why of GraphQL. The Facebook mobile app in about 2012, they were looking to move from a very kind of mobile web view oriented way of browsing the Facebook on the app to more of a kind of like actually using the APIs basically. And so it was becoming such a almost burden to have to request so much information about users and their posts and all of that, that they were looking to something that they could use differently. And so that was kind of where GraphQL came along. And GitHub has similar reasons, like basically kind of what we alluded to previously with the going through and so much extra bloat to help people along in their finding of the information that they needed. So also, it was, yeah, the 2 or 3, kind of what it boils down to is the amount of API calls that was required in order to get the information that they needed. And actually, kind of on a reverse perspective, sometimes you have where you are only making that one API call, but it is containing a lot of extra information that you may or may not need at that point in time. So let's say that we have like a user who has all of their information about everything they've bought or stored somewhere. And you only, like at one point in time, really need this data. But if you add it to some endpoint that you've accessed and currently use, does the endpoint really need to know about it in all these cases? So this is a metaphor that I have borrowed from the other kind of talk about how things kind of become this tangled web of Christmas lights. I thoroughly enjoyed it. How do we kind of set up the GraphQL? So GraphQL has a schema, and you define the object types. The schema itself can be queried, and we'll see that on the next slide. It's something that if you're saying building a client app that's going to pull data down from the GraphQL server, it's really nice to be able to be like, oh, so like what is my name on my artist? Like what is that data stored in? And so you can query against that. And you can also mark fields as required and not required. And so the exclamation point is for the required fields. And also you can deprecate fields if, say, instead of the full-on concept of like with REST, you might be versioning your API, you can also deprecate fields. And then you can basically can discontinue building and the client apps will stop asking for them eventually. Here is the example of, for our artist that we're building, how we would query that API and the information that we would get back, query the schema, and how the information that we would get back on the kind of the different types, and whether or not has to be it's required or not, and kind of it's very useful for as kind of a client developer what you need to do. And I'm using something called GraphQL, which we'll see a little bit later on, to build out my GraphQL schema, and we'll talk about the resolvers that GraphQL uses to, it builds them for you, basically. So you get a lot of free functionality from it, but we'll talk about what the resolvers are in a second. And also it gives you, theoretically, syntax highlighting, but it wasn't working there. So resolvers. Resolver is how your query knows what data to actually return. So you may have your GraphQL, but you probably have your data stored somewhere else. So we need to know how a lot of the times people are It seems like a very frequent use case is they're moving from the REST endpoints to GraphQL, and you have a ton of data, and this also plays a part in how you might want to do your authentication, which we'll talk about in a second. But so we have to know how we're going to get the data. So also, you might just want to use GraphQL because it gives you a lot of the mutations and queries for you. So let's talk about queries and mutations. So what is a query? A query is when you request the object and the fields. We saw this query before, and basically what we're asking for is all of the artists. And I think on the previous slide, there were a couple of fields that we saw when we queried back the schema, and not all of them we're actually asking for here. So in this instance, these are the only ones we need. And we can also have our relationship to the albums, and there's the like name, release date, and image on that as well. And so we can pass arguments to the query, say we wanted to filter it, or we want to do pagination or some other, basically restrict it in some way. And you can also get type info back on the individual fields with the type name, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is also not valid. I thought it was kind of interesting. Basically, if you're going to request anything, you have to return it, and it's kind of this weird way of saying it. When calling the GraphQL API, you must specify nested subfields until you only return scalars, which basically was what in the previous slide, this whole, like the albums, we have to have that ID or name or something. Like it's not valid to do any sort of just like give me everything. So what is a mutation? A mutation is how you pass variables and return an object, which in this case for our artists and albums app would be creating an artist with their monthly listeners, their name, and their image. And I actually thoroughly enjoyed that Spotify gives you the exact number of monthly listeners, and it fluctuates on like a fairly regular basis. So if you're curious on how many listeners your favorite artist has, it's kind of interesting. So authentication. GraphQL is not opinionated. Authentication could be done through server and OAuth, or even through the GraphQL directly. So kind of what I was talking about previously is a lot of people are kind of migrating to GraphQL, and you might just use kind of their old JSON web token flow or whatever already exists. So what are some of the advantages of GraphQL? You can determine if a query is valid via types. There's a lot of validation you can do on the query level to help you kind of do things correctly. And then it's also a grand buffet of data, and one of my coworkers called it this, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But this is also a disadvantage because basically you can ask for whatever and it will give it to you. So it's perfectly valid. So on our previous example with the artists and the albums and all of that, to basically continue to nest down from like artists, albums, and then within the album we want the artist information, and then maybe you want something else, and like basically you can, it's a security concern in the GraphQL community that if you don't define what your endpoint, the queries is expecting, you can basically like denial of service yourself. So it's something to watch out for. So here's why you might want to use a client so you don't do something like that. Some of the big clients are the Apollo clients, and one of the other big advantages of the client is caching. The GraphQL docs talk about how basically in order to do any sort of caching, you need to have some sort of globally unique identifier on your node. And if you think back, on the actual schema, there is an ID field, which actually, oh yeah, this ID field that it auto-generates on GraphQL, and that's so that when the Apollo client uses it, it can do all of that caching. And so the other advantage of the Apollo client is their subscriptions, and also so you can basically know like what you've already requested and get back new information about whatever your query has requested. And there's also Relay, which is supported by Facebook, but it's also very much built for Facebook's needs. And one of the really cool things I was reading about Relay recently is that, say you're using React, if you basically whatever you need in that component, you can ask for it directly and only the component knows about it. And it also builds the network request based on only what those components need and kind of gathers them. It's really interesting. But probably not if you're migrating your Ember app, you might not be super interested in it. But there is an add-on called Ember Cache, which uses cache which is a kind of relay for the rest of us, if you will, without the Facebook direct tie. So actually, we're going to skip the quick demo, but that was a lot of information. So we're going to take a quick trivia break for a prize. What year did Facebook announce GraphQL? And Ben is not allowed to answer. You're not allowed to answer. But you still can get a cat sticker if you'd like. Okay.
2015.
Yes. The cat stickers are right there, so if you just yes. And if anyone has any questions, you can also get a cat sticker. So, all right. So that is our quick trivia break. All right. So
This one is my soul.
Okay. That was everyone's favorite. Everyone keeps taking that one. Okay. But how did we come to start using GraphQL at Ibotta? We are splitting out a lot of the stuff that happens in our big Rails monolith, which was the thing that was originally alluded to as the possible Christmas light disaster. And you're able to query for user-specific content. And we're also moving API interactions from the app to Node.js GraphQL server. So a lot of things are already happening in GraphQL. So as someone who works on a lot of the legacy API endpoints and also the Ember app, we kind of would like to achieve parity with the app and also use a lot of the same technology. And our Ember website uses our old Rails API. And so here's kind of like this is what we're talking about. This is what we would be kind of looking to use GraphQL for. All right, so the other factors, we only want to make changes to the data consumption and not the UI. So we basically want to maintain what I just showed you on the previous slide. And we only really want it to affect certain endpoints, and some of which also might need data from other models, which are currently using the REST API, and which may or not be through GraphQL or Ember data. So this is kind of one of those, depending on which way we go, things would change. All right, so what would our success measures be? We would be able to delete a ton of code. We'd have no loss of functionality. We'd make showing offers on the web a less confusing process. And also kind of, for the user on their side of things, have the same level of parity between what they'd expect to see kind of in the app versus on the web. So there's two big players in the Ember add-on space for GraphQL, and we'll talk about both of them and do a quick demo of the latter. Actually, it's the former. So there are Ember Apollo clients and the Ember GraphQL adapter. And the big differences are the Ember GraphQL adapter can be integrated directly with the existing Ember data model. So if you're, like in our case, migrating an existing Ember app, you probably have a lot of stuff in an Ember data model. And your relationships can be with the rest of your Ember data rather than having to migrate everything over to GraphQL. So that's kind of another thing that could be an advantage or could not be an advantage. And so some of the cons, it doesn't currently work out of the box with Apollo's post request format, which is kind of a little bit of a nitpick, but I lost a lot of time to it at one point. So, but also you may be able to limit fields by overriding on adapter level, which could possibly, there is kind of it requests a ton of information, and you might not need it in every single point that you're using your model. So say that on our artist, we have like our name, our ID, release date, all of that, and all of the album info. On the like main artist page, we probably don't need all of that. So the one big issue with the Ember GraphQL adapter is that it asks for basically everything. So if you're kind of wanting to use GraphQL because it doesn't ask for everything, you lose a lot of that advantage. But there is some talk about possibly being able to override it. And I haven't had any success with that yet, but that's if I would be looking into that if I were to go with Ember GraphQL adapter. So here's how we would set it up. This is our model for our artist. And then, so basically what it does is you import the serializer, and it serializes the Ember model and then requests that. And so basically everything in the model is requested on the GraphQL side. And so this is just the endpoint configuration, and this is our asking for our model data back. And so here's kind of where it gets into our generated query, which we might not want all of that. This is basically everything in our model. So, which brings us to this, which is my comment that was about on a issue of the kind of like, basically the author was having a lot of issues with, he had a lot of nested associations, and it was requesting all of the data, and kind of huge network request, basically. And I enjoyed this because it was kind of the Ember ethos of being very polite and very nice, but we are going in a different direction, and I'll tell you about the other direction. And actually, if you have any kind of interest in some of the other pros and cons of the Ember GraphQL adapter, the previous comments on this are actually really great as well, too. So I recommend it if you're interested in this at all. So the Ember Apollo client. We talked about the Apollo client a little bit earlier, and some of the advantages that it had when you were like doing caching and persistent queries and all of that. It's very directly linked to the Apollo client, and you can specify your data with actual queries, and you can very easily replace only very specific endpoints, and you can fetch more for pagination with the Git observable, and so this makes use of a lot of the advantages of Apollo with the ability to kind of know what I've already requested and get back kind of new updates and those kind of changes. But also this means that you have to make sure that you let your routes know that when you're not there, you don't want to keep observing, otherwise you may end up with other problems. So some of the cons, kind of an Ibotta specific con, is that we have a lot currently dependent on our model data, but this actually might be a pro because we'd be able to refactor and rip a lot out. So, I don't know. Yeah. Oh. It just, there it goes.
So
like
a thing that I've noticed here
is
that
this is not.
Yeah, it's like it's got to have some weight support.
Here, I'll use the other one. Or oh, there we go. Okay.
All right.
Yep,
So then let's see where. All right. No, don't breathe.
Oh, yeah. I think it's good. There we go. That's weird. We lost the screen share.
If you don't want to worry about it.
Okay. I don't really want to try to move anything. So yes, that was our cons. And so one of the advantages that we talked about a little bit before is that we're not requesting the entire object graph, and we can just replace it in the routes that we care about. And you might already be using the Apollo client for your server interactions or possibly other API or GraphQL interactions. So it might be something that you're already familiar with and that you want to use as well. And that's actually in our case we are. So setting up the Ember Apollo client, write queries and mutations in the GraphQL file. You use your query in the routes. And we're going to go through kind of all of this in a second. So if this seems like a lot of information, we'll walk you through in a second. And then you can also have mutations in your actions and your routes. And we kind of talked about this a second ago, but you want to make sure to unsubscribe from your watch queries because otherwise you might have a bad time. And also you can use the Apollo service directly if you want to do something that the Ember Apollo client currently doesn't support, or if you want to use it outside of your route. So here's our query that we're going to use for this example app, which kind of is the same one we showed earlier. And then kind of add it to our route. And then also if you are, you can also filter it by, say, like your params for ID. If we had like the artists for individual artists, we could inject that as well. Or like we, and then, so this is actually our GraphQL endpoint that we've talked about a couple times before. And since we're using the Apollo client, we are able to directly interact with this API endpoint on GraphQL's hosted GraphQL schema, basically. So this is the demo. All right. So we are going to make a couple changes to our app. So we have our cat app, And we have our albums and our artists. So does anyone have any, so the fields that we have are like the, so let's add the image source. And that basically for our, then we can add it to our view. All right. Oh, so that's mine. So I picked this picture for a very specific reason, that it comes from this Crazy Cat Concoctions website. And what they sell are like themed cat lady type goods. So I enjoyed it. And yeah. So does anyone have any questions about Ember Apollo and kind of the Ember implementations before we go over a couple of GraphQL resources and kind of what the actual app we have right here running? Yeah.
So if you're using Ember Apollo, you are altogether ditching Ember Data's store model, caching, all that stuff.
Yeah, probably. You can actually, one of the things that people were talking about was basically building kind of an abstracted object that would watch for a lot of the changes on the Ember Apollo, or the object Ember Apollo gives to you. And so you could do computed properties and stuff on that in order to kind of abstract it a layer further outside of just the whatever Ember Apollo throws at you, basically. Yeah.
Follow-up.
Yep.
Is this compatible with Ember Inspector? You can see what things you currently have cached, etc.
It probably wouldn't be. If I had it, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it probably wouldn't be.
They just serialize like regular.
Yeah. Yeah. But, yeah.
Is the Apollo client what you chose to avoid the susceptibility of weakness as far as security?
That's one thing, but it's kind of one of the big players in the space, and it also gives you a lot of caching and on the query side, so that you don't have to have all of the resolvers like looking for everything on an individual level all the time. So the other main player is Relay, which has a lot of advantages if like you're working directly with React, I've found. So like if you really want to have it tied directly to your like components and that kind of thing. And you also want to use, I mean, you probably could, you want something to kind of serve your GraphQL query, like you basically, yeah, so it's one of the big players in that space, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the subscriptions, maximum model, like watching? Is that like a server pushing updates to you, or how does that work?
I think that depends on how you configure it, but I think you might have to configure that on the GraphQL or whatever you're using on the server side, like whether it's how it's going to actually push that data. But yeah.
So the way you have it set up, is it just like a one-time request?
Yeah. Unfortunately, but yeah. I guess my big thing with something like this compared to like, so kind of from my perspective personally, as I've been building a lot of JSON APIs, I've been thinking about like how I would do this in GraphQL or how we would support it in GraphQL. And I think one of the big things is being able to get the data that you actually need in the moment. So like that's, yeah, kind of another big thing, yeah. That's a good question.
JSON API so returns like, it isn't like a lot of customization in the field as far as I understand it.
You can do like parameter filtering, right? You can do filtering by parameters on the JSON, yeah. So, right. I think that the big thing would be, so on that level, you could basically do parameterization on like something like the individual artist endpoint or like that. The real advantage of say GraphQL is to get data from the other models or like the other, yeah. Right.
some ways it seems like GraphQL absolutely very heavily to
Hmm. Right.
what are the pros and cons there? It sounds like you already have GraphQL.
Yeah, so it kind of, yeah, exactly. It kind of is a, yeah.
Just curious about.
Why we didn't go for, like, yeah, but you couldn't.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if you're in choose which you
Right.
wanna pick,
Why graph?
Well, I'm curious, I don't know.
Yeah.
For what I've seen, I haven't worked a ton with
Mhm.
directly with guy team that's all the time raving about it. And from what he's talked about, a big advantage is the fact that, especially the server-side implementations of GraphQL allow arbitrary queries to be deployed. So the big thing is less, the unique advantage is less about the specific wire format, what the HTTP response looks like, what the shape of the JSON object.
Right.
But instead, it's more about the fact that if I want to change a client, I don't have to push an update to the server as well, because the server handles the queries generic. It doesn't know what one endpoint versus another. You typically hit the endpoint, the GraphQL endpoint, and it basically lets the client almost directly query the database and get back the shape of the response that the client wants. So you no longer have to couple your client updates with server updates.
That's a very good answer.
I also know that the JSON API is from
Yeah. You also can do a lot of the deprecation stuff too. Yeah. Cool. Does anyone have any other questions, or we'll just? Yes.
So, and perhaps it's been addressed so far, right? So if you did, feel free to. But I'm curious.
Shut up.
Not you. So I'm curious, given what we just talked about, how basically the client returns query, and you talked briefly about how you want to prevent sort of
Yeah, exactly.
using a good client.
Yep. How do you balance the two?
Well, how do you prevent malicious actors from gossiping? Like this, every GraphQL implementation I've seen so far, which hasn't been many, but every implementation I've seen is basically just exposed the database to the world. There's security measures. It doesn't look like passwords, but it basically says like, if you want to run the most expensive query you can possibly think of, just lock the database for 5 minutes. Have fun. And so I'm curious, in a world where the whole goal is allow the client to submit the query they want so that we don't have to update that thing every time, how do you lock that down so that the client can't submit malicious queries?
I think from what I've seen in production, you probably do want to use like the very kind of define your queries. You probably don't want to do the let's have everything buffet. You will have a bad time probably. You have lost so good. Yeah, so it is kind of a huge trade-off.
Well, I mean,
but you can't do it.
Not necessarily, right? Like it's relatively simple to allow like a reasonable amount of variability within relationships, but you can stop things like nesting the same relationships within one another. Like you can allow a lot of, let's say that in a lot of basic, endpoints, say you're accessing a widget model, and there's 10. Let's say there's 30 attributes on the widget model. You can say like you can access any of these through a planned query on. You can access any of the 30 widgets, like within your 30 properties of the widget, and then the client can like request what it needs. But maybe you say like I'm going to restrict certain relationships that I know are expensive on the database. GraphQL doesn't necessarily care about that. It's more like presentational, but you can say I know that fetching this is 5 joins in my table, so I'm going to restrict this to things that I know I'm on.
So, I mean, I think in response to that, but my concern with that would be that it's sort of a blacklist, whitelist approach, where it seems like GraphQL is basically you need to think of every possible query that could be potentially too expensive for a client to run, and make sure you explicitly blacklist that type of query in some way. So, I can't query this relationship, or I can't exceed this many results in this result set. Whereas something like JSON API or any kind of REST JSON is a whitelist, where basically you tell the client these are the queries you are allowed to perform, and by its very nature, you're sure that each one of those is allowable from a performance.
Well, like what I'm hearing out of this is that GraphQL seems built for people who control their own APIs. It's like I haven't seen a like NFL GraphQL database out in the wild. I think it's probably for that reason. That like since you are like controlling your own backend and your client, you get to not fuck yourself.
I don't agree with that at all. I think, like, if you look at the some of the most accessed APIs are using GraphQL for this reason, right? Like Facebook, GitHub, Foursquare, like all these people building things on top of like location data, like they don't know what the fuck they're doing, right? So they're asking like.
But they probably narrow that down.
Yeah.
You can't get every possible location data that Facebook has.
Yeah, of course. Like they make certain restrictions on like pagination you have to do. Like you can't say Facebook tell me about every place you go about, right?
And so that sounds like the blacklisting kind of thing.
And that's my concern. Like if you imagine an API and the scope and complexity of Facebook's, like just the sheer number of different types of things you can request. And then you hand it to somebody and say, now think of every query that could be malicious from a GraphQL perspective and blacklist it. That seems like I would not want to job.
Well, I don't know, maybe you just put a facade on top of it, so it's more like a REST API, or like it's two GraphQL APIs talking to each other, or one has less access.
But like ultimately, it comes down to like a given request is hitting, say, like Postgres database, just for something simple to think about. Like you could easily set a timeout, like you could do this upstream outside of GraphQL. So like, yeah, you can request anything. I'm not guaranteeing that I'll respond to you if you try to do something that's going to slam my database or block it up for however long. Like I might return you a 400 data request because like I'm not going to service this without using like a blacklist.
G70 second week student. And if I say anything weird, you buy me lunch. Well, what I've been hearing, obviously, fast, it sounds like this would be a good platform for, like Adobe. In the company, I can use this to query faster to send out the data that I need, therefore making the process faster on mine, and while another location isn't being bogged down by my request, as Adobe.
Microservice.
Yeah. Well, it's some kind of
Purely internal use.
I got
malicious users.
Turbo engines already running.
Yeah, it works pretty well if you already have data in a lot of cases, or you could use mutations to add additional data. And it is something that you could kind of, if you're kind of trying to prototype something and you only want to query specific data, you could basically set up GraphQL and add data there and kind of prototype out whatever you wanted to access that way, if that makes sense. So that would kind of silo things that way, if I understand your question.
I think I found a way to phrase the bridge between these two things.
Okay.
I highly doubt that Facebook's developers use their public GraphQL API for their own client.
Yeah.
They do.
They do?
Yeah.
Get the fuck out.
They've been since 2015. Once they've never had a deprecated client in GraphQL. Which I think is a bad line.
Yeah, that's why I didn't use that one. I still don't believe it. I still don't believe it.
I mean, so here's the thing that in the GraphQL, right? It says like we won't return you anything that returns more than 500,000. Like
Yeah, but I think there's lots of ways. So I guess my
yeah.
Meagan, we'll go.
That was pretty much it. There's some other resources included on the slides, and thank you, Ben, and kind of the all internal products team for their help. Does anyone have any other questions or? Yeah, I don't know. There's one more. Yeah.
I think my question got answered.
Oh, cool.
I was wondering more so on the line of if you're limiting or blacklisting, isn't the point of having a client where can you limit what requests your client is going to make? Or why would you have to blacklist versus having a client? If GraphQL is open, you have a client there, but it's open. Can't you have a set of rules at the client level? I don't know. I mean, I guess if you're blacklisting, you're stopping that. Yeah, my question.
He's talking about like malicious actors.
Yeah, we're kind of more.
I have access to the API and then do something to like take that.
Yeah, they're trying to like time out something, a million.
Something that you respond to with right, and the magic word.
Yeah.
Press part.
Right. Well, thank you all for coming. Cat stickers for all the question askers.